I'm Nicholas Jarrell, and I'm chairman of the BCS at the moment. And the first thing I'd like to say is wish you all a very happy new year and a smoother one, if that's possible, than 2020. I'd also like to say I hope everyone's safe and all your friends and relatives are equally so, in view of the terrible earthquakes and the problems in Croatia that doesn't get the publicity here that it would do in any other less traumatic times with COVID and with the problems of Mr. Trump. One other thing to say before I introduce our speaker, and that is just to thank everyone on the committee for arranging this, our first Zoom meeting. There are more to follow. The Croatian ambassador has agreed that he will speak later in the year about being a Croatian ambassador here during 2020 and the events that took place, not least Brexit and his role as chairman of the EU group here in Britain for part of that time. We're very fortunate to kick off our meetings with Heather Mayling's talk tonight about her father's extraordinary exploits and experiences after he was shot down over then Yugoslavia into what is now Croatia, his rescue and the way by the partisans and his move to freedom in their hands and through himself. And in addition, how she investigated this, I think in 2019. Heather lives in Brecon Beacons. I see I hear she's described it as heaven for hill walkers, and it's clearly something in the genes given her father's experiences in Croatia. But Heather, we're extremely grateful for you to agree to speak tonight, and I think it's time that I hand over to you now. So over to you, Heather.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for everybody turning up tonight and welcoming people that I know that have joined from Croatia and Slovenia, and so it's wonderful to see everyone. So my talk, I'm going to start off with a short film, which will take about 15 minutes, and after that I'm going to go into a slide presentation. So I think I don't need to introduce the film, it speaks for itself. So let's see if I can manage the technology now. Hello, my name's Heather Mayling, and today I want to take you all on a journey, a true story about my dad, how lucky he was to survive, and how lucky I am to be here. My dad was a prolific diary writer throughout his whole life, and like many servicemen, their wartime experiences were not frequently talked about. But thanks to the diary, we are able to know so much about his story. So buckle up, it's gonna be a bumpy ride.
When cannon shells start hitting the petrol tanks of a Wellington bomber, it is usually a matter of seconds before the aircraft explodes. That is exactly what happened to us, and why I don't remember very much about being shot down.
The date is the 7th of July 1944, the time 1:30 a.m, and Flying Officer Derek Mayling of the RAF Volunteer Reserve finds himself lying in a field. His first thought was, well, it's too cold for hell, so this must be heaven. He felt his parachute harness and clothes and realised he was still alive. He had landed in a field of standing oats close to the edge of a wood, narrowly missing the branches of a fallen oak. He hid his parachute and Mae West, his life jacket, in a ditch and walked to the top of the hill to survey the scenery. Checking his compass, he saw that the country to the southwest was well wooded, undulating, culminating in some fairly high mountains, which were silhouetted in the moonlight. He decided they were 15 to 20 miles away and started to walk towards them, to reach some safe place before dawn. Their target that night had been the Feuersbrunn aerodrome in Austria, on the outskirts of Vienna.
We flew across the Adriatic without incident. Kept within the main stream of aircraft to the target, we descended to 6,000 feet, dropped our bombs and set course for home. We lost height to about 500 feet, flew at maximum speed, 215 miles per hour, to get clear of the area. It was obvious that there was something in the air that night. Several aircraft burst into flames and crashed. Eventually, we had to leave the comparative safety of low level and climb to avoid the flak defences of Graz and Maribor. An aircraft on the starboard burst into flames and we had to alter course to avoid it. As the navigator, I went forward to map read as they approached the Drava River. We crossed the river and I returned to my table in the cabin. Then all hell was let loose. I heard a tearing sound and looked towards the tail to see tracer cannon shells coming through the floor. Wireless operator Sergeant Hunt collapsed to the floor, and the aircraft did a stall turn to port and went into a spin. There was a roar and a fluttering sound like the wing beats of a gigantic bird, and the whole port side of the fuselage became a solid sheet of flame.
Mailing attached his parachute pack to the clips on his chest and left his seat. He fell on the bulkhead door between the pilot and the radio. He struggled through the escape exit, ripping off his helmet, fearing it would catch on something. Something struck his head. A violent pain seared through his body, as if being compressed in all directions. And that's all he remembered until he came to in a field. He had landed in Yugoslavia, what is now Slovenia, near the town of Dobovec, which is northwest of Zagreb. Mailing started to walk towards the southwest. At approximately 3 a.m, he crossed a small stream and a road and came to a railway line. He started to cross, and then, from his right, a voice ordered him to halt.
I walked faster and heard bullets whistling past me, followed by the low chatter of a machine gun, probably a 9mm Schmeiser. I ducked and ran as fast as I could until well away from the railway line.
He later mused on why the sentry had not followed. Perhaps he thought it was just a local person, or he was enjoying a nap and returned to it.
By 5 a.m. I had walked 10 miles or more. I had a horrible taste in my mouth, and looking for water, found a stream which seemed fairly clean. I knelt down and fell into the water. The pain in my knees was agonizing. For the first time, I noticed I had been badly wounded. My trousers were soaked, and I was weak from loss of blood. I was freezing cold and it was getting light. My knees were very stiff, and a horrible aching pain throbbed through my body. I had no alternative but to go to a farm and find help.
In World War II, 250,000 Allied soldiers and airmen, British, American, Australian, Canadian and others, were stranded behind enemy lines and became prisoners of war. Just a few thousand, 3,000 to 5,000, evaded his capture, stayed free and made that home run back to Britain. They walked hundreds of miles, swam raging rivers in the dark, climbed mountains, rode horses and trains, sneaked past checkpoints, and hid in hovels, chateaux, towns and cities. Just as many tried and failed. Crews of Bomber Command knew their chances of survival were slim, and by the end of hostilities, 50% were lost. But they were briefed to believe that they could survive, and most chose to believe it. The prospect of bailing out from a burning aircraft and the likelihood of falling into enemy hands was terrifying. But military intelligence briefed aircrew on escape and evasion tactics in July 1944. I wonder if Flying Officer Mailing was paying attention.
The good escaper is a man who keeps himself fit, cheerful, and comfortable. He should be a man with sound common sense, and above all, a man of great determination. Keep close to hedges, and never walk in the center of fields. Keep to the edge of woods, rather than walk through the middle. If you hear a noise, Crouch down and listen. Don't rush blindly away, for you may give yourself away by doing so. All animals in Europe are edible. Men should be impressed with the importance of forgetting old prejudices when faced with the necessity of eating anything they can get hold of. Cats and dogs, providing so much food, are worth some trouble in capture by friendly advances. The liver is the most valuable part. Either animal, stewed with some edible leaves, will make an excellent meal.
Mayling had grown up in the countryside in Northumberland and had always had a love of the wild. A former Boy Scout, he was a good shot. If anyone could survive, he could. But at the age of 21, he was seriously injured and in danger of infection and gangrene, in a strange country, without the language and knowledge of the people and culture. It's hard to believe that in a generation things would have changed so much. Today's 20-somethings would be much more savvy. Fortunately, he had landed in an area where the population were to some extent pro-British, but this varied from place to place. He later discovered that in the area he came down, it was pure luck that he didn't fall into the hands of the feared Ustasha. He was handed over to the partisans, who were keen to assist him in getting home, and went to extraordinary lengths to achieve this, travelling mainly by night and hiding by day. But his injuries were severe.
My left knee was cut right across the top, exposing the whole of my kneecap. There was a deep cut on my left knee and a little hole in my thigh where a 9mm bullet passed. My nose was broken, and I had a deep gash across my forehead and numerous scratches, bruises and cuts of varying severity.
The physical injuries were easier to assess. The psychological impact was seldom talked about. In fact, he only told the story on significant anniversaries. 1969, I was 10, and I remember my dad holding forth for some story for the whole weekend while close friends listened attentively. Anyway, to return to the story.
So much had happened so suddenly. I was rather bewildered, and the shock had not worn off sufficiently to think clearly. From the time I'd put my Mae West and parachute in the ditch, I must have walked mostly in a delirium, almost unconsciously. I could remember trivial things like eating a piece of lettuce and picking up a stick to help me on my way. I could not exactly think of my route, and the rapid succession of hill and dale, wood and pasture had fogged my memory, and I could not retrace my steps in my mind. However, here I was. I had found myself in a strange land, among strange but seemingly friendly people. At first, I was rather scared of them. Although they talked about partisani, I did not really trust them. They had given me strange food, and I did not know whether it would be safe to eat it. They had put me to bed, and I was afraid of lice and typhus, yet my bed was clean enough, and the food tasted very good indeed.
Mayling kept moving for 20 days, travelling by night, hiding by day, cigarettes and cockroaches, treating injuries with iodine which made him faint with the pain, sleeping and then being woken and told to move immediately. But there were high points, mainly regarding food. Meals like a toadstool omelette served by one farmer's wife, of which he declared, "A finer dish could not be obtained in the best London hotel." Black humour was typical of my dad in difficult situations, and of his generation, making light of situations as a coping mechanism, even to the end of his life. He kept himself busy with his diary, observing everything he saw. In reality, he was running scared. The penalties of falling into enemies' hands for both allies and those who collaborated were truly horrific.
We halted, and I was told to hide in the ditch, whilst they reconnoitred the railway line. I was exhausted, and needed no encouragement to sit down. We moved on rapidly, and reached the banks of the river, followed it down to a bend, where there was a ford, and one of my men gave a low whistle. It was answered from the other side, and a man waded into midstream. We scrambled down the bank, and I got on his shoulders. He waded out, carrying me on his back, and somehow managed to cross the river without falling in. On the other side, there were 4 fully armed and uniformed partisans, one of whom was a Russian who had been captured by the Germans and later escaped from a forced labor camp in Hungary. We stopped long enough for the tough gentleman who had carried me across to put on his boots and then struck southeast over the plain towards the dark, misty mass of the Medvednica hills. An ME-109, a Messerschmitt, flew past. It seemed to be searching the woods for something, but we were well hidden by trees and were not seen. Then the shooting started, and mortar shells began to burst in the road ahead. We struck off the path and plunged straight through the woods. The column closed up, and we descended to a river. The shooting continued, but no longer directed at us. 1 or 2 of our party had been killed, and they were buried where they fell.
At this point, the group were being pursued into the mountains by the feared Ustasha, and they were gaining. Due to his injuries, their progress was slowed, and the partisans asked if he could ride a horse. Of course, said Mailing, ever the Boy Scout.
I was quickly learning how good my horse was. He was a stallion from the Ukraine, a Russian horse, which had been captured by the Germans when they overwhelmed a Cossack brigade in the Don Basin. He had been shipped to the Balkans and recaptured by the partisans in northern Yugoslavia. Unfortunately, he had been ridden by all manner and means of people, and his mouth was hard as iron. However, he was quite manageable and very quiet under fire.
Reaching Chasma was a turning point. This was partisan country, and it was safe to travel by day without an escort. By now he'd been joined by several American servicemen who, like him, had survived being shot down. At Chasma, the Americans swam in the river, and my dad, with his legs bandaged, sat on the bank and picked lice out of his shirt. In Chasma, he met a partisan doctor, Jelka Vesiniak. Jelka gave my father an English textbook in Yugoslavian. By turning it around, he could communicate with those around him, and it made a huge difference. Inside the book, we can see some really interesting phrases that he wrote, and it made me think that there was probably romance in the air. On the 25th of July 1944, just past the village of Vocin, he said goodbye to the partisans. He wrote in his diary, "The road lay up into the hills beside a perfect trout stream, where water tumbled down waterfalls between stately pines. The partisan sentry saluted smartly and asked for his papers. He walked up the path into the wood and, turning a corner, came across a log cabin hidden in the trees. In the style of all great war movies, a British soldier, George Clarkson, came out of the hut and said with that mastery of understatement, 'My God, an Englishman.' In his original account, my father finished with, 'A few days later we flew back to Italy,' but that is another story."
There we are. So that's my dad's story, and some of it is unbelievable. And what I've discovered is that when you start investigating a story, you find out all sorts of things under the surface. So I'm going to move now into the slideshow, which I'm going to cut as much as I can so that we can have questions at the end. Right, so let me see, where are we? Okay, from Klanjec to Vocin escaping with the partisans. I think it was probably the map that I saw that was the thing that really interested me. Here was this map with a little dotted line across it that you'll be able to see. It starts with a parachute. Oh dear, it's not very good. Starts with a parachute, and then it follows here through the Medvednica and across Croatia, and ends up in Vocin. And so I'd had this idea that, you know, one day maybe I should go and do the journey. Perhaps I could find my way, and you know, it's one of those things I put off and put off. So this is my guide, easy guide now to how to have an adventure. So the first thing you need to do is, first of all, have a large glass of wine. And then if your trip is time specific, as mine was, I wanted to be there for the 75th anniversary, then the next step is to book your flight. Don't book any accommodation. And the next thing is to figure out all the rest of the story and on what you're going to do. And what was amazing was how things just happened. People just popped up, things just happened. I was in a village in Wales in conversation with somebody I knew, and she said, "Oh, my daughter-in-law is Croatian. She'll be able to help you." And so this was Liz McLean, Snezana's mother-in-law, and Snezana got in touch, and we got together and talked about the project. And it was Snezana really that was able to put me in touch with people on the ground, and I really thank her for that. And we're not following the tourist route here. So here I am with no language in a strange country with strange people. The similarities with my dad's story are quite incredible, really. And this is what the ground looks like when you're looking southwest towards the distant hills. And this is the area that we think that my dad was in, which is very close to a place called Klanjec, which is in Slovenia, just on the over the Slovenian border. And the country is well wooded, undulating, just as my dad described. And then the other bit of research I did was I went on the internet, as you do, and I found this book. And I thought, well, I'd see if I can find the person who was able to put this book together. And sure enough, I did. And so here is Robert on the right and his father, Vincent, on the left. And we're a place called Sveta Yuri, which is really pretty much where my dad thought that he came down. And now Vincent is actually pointing out where some aircraft wreckage came down during the war. So we decided that we're definitely on the right track here. And there was even a stream, a road, and a railway track. And I looked carefully when I was here to make sure there was no sentry there. And I didn't actually cross the railway track. I would have crossed over the Schengen border there. I probably would have got into all sorts of trouble. And these barns feature a lot in the story because obviously my dad was hiding. He spent a lot of time hiding in the forests. He also spent a lot of time hiding in barns. And very early on in the story, when he went to the farm with his injuries, he was taken in, and eventually a doctor was found. The partisan doctor came and stitched up his wounds without any anesthetic and bandaged him up. And he had to stay around in the area to recover so that he could then continue with the journey. But what I discovered was, and this is really interesting, there was no night walk, there was no sentry, and the story is actually very different. And I later discovered that my father's aircraft came down in Croatia, just south of Klanjec, and that he, in fact, came down very close to the aircraft. The local people came out, they realized the danger that he was in, and they called the partisans, and the partisans took him away and kept him safe. And this is the passport that he was given by the partisans as soon as he was well enough to travel. There's a description here for those of you who can't read it. There's a description to say, this is what happened to this airman, and please give him safe conduct. Signed by Bartok, who was the local partisan chief, and my dad describes him in great detail. My dad was a great diary writer, and he had a lot of time on his hands at this time. So he wrote a lot about life in the farms in this part of the world, and wrote in incredible detail about it. So it was really interesting to go and visit some of the folk museums and see what the farms would have looked like in those days. The diary that he wrote, the story that he wrote, or the report, I suppose I should call it, that was really aimed at the local servicemen in his squadron, those who might find themselves in the same situation. And so my dad wrote everything in great detail, anything that could be helpful. And here we are, we're in the square in Klanjec, and we've got my two guides here. Let me get the pointer out. We've got Davor, we've got Davor, we've got Stepan, we've got the local mayor's representative and people from the press there. And so this is the start of the journey where we're actually going to be following some of the routes. Now, this might not look like much of a footpath to you guys, and it is a very little path through the forest. Stepan, who's here tonight on the call, Stepan had done some research on the routes that my dad would have taken, and we're pretty certain, Stepan is pretty certain, that this is the footpath that my dad would have taken. And you can see the big grin on my face, and it's just amazing to think that I'm now walking on the ground that he trod, and thinking of him probably with a couple of sticks or something like that, hobbling along this path. And so we walked quite a lot that day, and then we crossed over to the Medvenica hills. And there was my dad describes sleeping in the open, sleeping in barns, certainly not sleeping in houses like this, and definitely not sleeping in the place where we stayed. So that was quite good to be in such a lovely place in such luxurious surroundings. And so the next day we set off, and we're walking through the hills. We walked for about 6 hours. And we're following the main ridge. We're not zigzagging in the way that my dad had to. We're just following the main paths. And I'm really glad that Stepan was there, because there is lots of paths up there, and it would have been very easy to get lost. And this is what it looks like. It's forested all the way. The sun was very hot that day, but it was nice and shady under the trees. And we walked all day. We didn't meet anybody apart from this gent who was at one of the huts. And so we stopped and had a chat, and he looked very friendly as well. And it was really a really lovely day. And eventually we get to the end of the ridge, and the path drops down. And when my dad was in this area, I'm going to read now from his report. The going was much easier, as we could keep to the paths, and the scenery was wonderful. We stopped at lunchtime by a clear mountain spring and went on again until the path eased and we entered a sunlit glade. I thought that our numbers had increased, and then I saw we had joined by a whole body of 200 or 300 partisans who were waiting for us. I tumbled off my horse and was introduced to the major. He could not speak English and took me to his wireless operator, who introduced himself as Peter. He had lived nearly all his life in England, South Shields to be exact, and we sat down in the shade and talked. He had trained as a paratroop and commando in the army and had been dropped into Yugoslavia as a wireless operator with Brigadier McLean and the 1st British mission. That when they suggested he should return home to North Africa for a rest, he had declined and remained to fight with the partisans in northern Croatia. Here I heard the BBC News on his wireless set, and I lay on my back and ate an enormous quantity of cheese, cake, and garlic. When I felt full, Peter said, "Go on, you never know when you're going to eat again." I had already learnt this and tucked in again until there was nothing left. So the Brigadier McLean that we're referring to has a connection with the society as well. Fitzroy McLean was sent by Churchill to Croatia to find out what the partisans were up to, and were they people that the British could collaborate with. They seem to be making great efforts and great inroads in the fight, and so Brigadier McLean went off, parachuted in, and apparently he is the model for James Bond in the James Bond stories. He's also related to Snezana as well. So I don't know if you realize you had such an important person in your midst. Anyway, to continue with the story. So eventually they come down to flatter country and a place called Sveta Helena. They, from this point on, my dad describes and names the towns and villages that he went to. And life is getting easier now. It's easier to move about. Don't have to travel by night now. We're in partisan country. And there we are. You can see now we've come down here. We're coming here, and we're heading down now to Chasma. And here we are. We've arrived. My dad describes this. He knew he was going to give up his horse at Chasma, and so he decided he would gallop up the hill into the old medieval town at the top of the hill with a flourish. Only problem is when he got there, there was nobody there to meet him, so it all fell a bit flat. And I did wonder if I would ride a horse, gallop a horse up the hill as well in memory, but as we can see, it's probably not really very suitable for that sort of thing. So anyway, the Americans, as we know, they swam in the river. My dad sat on the bank, and he couldn't go in the water because of his injuries. But there were advantages to having injuries, and one of them was to visit the mysterious partisan doctor. I like this story because when he arrived, she was busy. He had to wait to see her, and she was operating on a partisan soldier in the wine shop. Of course, what a sensible place where you've got alcohol on hand to clean wounds and that sort of thing. And it was Jelka that gave him this book, and as we've seen in the film, some interesting things, phrases for use behind enemy lines. I had to translate them on Google Translate, and you can see very surprising things for this kind of scenario. Anyway, I think it was unrequited love. I think he just absolutely hero worshipped this woman. So we're off again. We're carrying on east. We go through all sorts of very small places, which are definitely not on the tourist trail. And my dad writes about the things that he saw and the places that he went to. Okay, and eventually we reach a place called Vocin. Just apologise, I'm just cutting down on my notes a bit. Okay, and when I arrived in Vocin, it was late on a Sunday evening in the rain, and I met the most wonderful Airbnb hosts, and Katerina here is in the middle of this picture here at the back. Diane and Katerina looked after me, and they were absolutely amazing in that they were able to uncover some of the story that would never have got uncovered. And we were drinking a glass of rakia together, And they said, oh, our neighbor made this rakia. He's in his 80s. And I said, would he have been here during the war? And they said, well, we'll find out. So we went down to visit Savo. Here's Savo on the left-hand side of the picture. And of course, he had been around during the war. And of course, he knew where the airfield was, where the dramatic return to Italy took place. And he also showed us, we go out, just go around the corner from his house, and he says, I'll show you where the British mission was. So this is the terminal building for the Vocin airstrip, where the British were supplying the partisans by air, ammunition, food, anything they needed, and any injured partisans or injured servicemen could leave by the same route. So this is the well, this is all that's left of the British mission in Vocin. And we're nearly at the end of the story now. I don't know if you remember the perfect trout stream that he described, walking up by the perfect trout stream. And here we have the perfect trout stream. He had really had quite a good time on his journey. He described from very early on, when he knew that his injuries were going to prevent him flying again, he said he had the first good night's sleep that he'd had for many, many months. I think the effects of the losing so many aircrew had a big impact on the servicemen. The night that my father went out, 25 crew were lost, 5 aircraft, 25 crew. My dad was the only person to return from that night. So his story is one, a lot of joy and, you know, funny things that happened, but also he does remind us of the serious side of things. And I wanted to go to the Ottoman Tower, the Turkish Tower, just to spend a moment there and think of these young girls with their ammunition running out and being killed. And here's the airfield. And in the film, in his story, he talks about we flew out a few days later, and that's another story. Well, it really is quite a story, because what happened was there was an increase in fighting in the area. The enemy was coming nearer, and it was unsafe for any planes to come and land, and so flying was stopped. And eventually we get to the 5th of August, and they send a message back to Italy, and they say, if you don't come soon, there won't be anything left to collect. They were really that worried. They couldn't go out, they couldn't walk in the forest, it was too dangerous. So the message came through the next day that the Mitchell aircraft was coming to collect them. So that I think the whole of the British mission was disbanded in that day. They gave all their equipment away. They burnt any documents that would have been valuable to the enemy. And as they're setting out to go and rendezvous with the aircraft, they hear the guns starting to fire in the area. The partisans go off to cause a bit of a skirmish and to distract the enemy, and they jump on horseback. They gallop the 5 miles down into Vocin, and they wait there for the aircraft to arrive. And then they see the aircraft coming, the Mitchell aircraft, flanked by fighters. Remember, the fighters are at the very end of their flying ability. They haven't got enough fuel to do anything, but they're there as a show of strength. And the aircraft lands, it bumps across the field, this field that we can see in the picture. And the pilot opens the window, he shouts across to them. He said, whose are those tanks down the road? And they said, well, they're certainly not ours. And he said, they're about a mile away. Let's get the hell out of here. So they scramble on board this aircraft. And then the aircraft is picking up speed, bumping across the field here. Are we going to make it? Is something going to go wrong? Have we got too much weight on the aircraft? And eventually the aircraft lifts off and they're away. And they return to Italy, where the squadron is based. My dad writes this report, and he wasn't really treated as a superhero. I know he's my dad, obviously he's a superhero, but first of all, he was interviewed by British intelligence, by the FBI, because they thought, maybe, who is this guy that suddenly appeared? Is he a spy? Has he been got at by the other side? So people treated him with a bit of suspicion. And then much later on, he wanted to join, there are all sorts of societies, and he hoped that he would be able to join the society of people that had escaped from the enemy territory and got back. And they said, no, you can't do that. Yugoslavia is not the right field of war, so I'm afraid there's no chance of joining. He did join the Caterpillar Club, so that was the club for people that had used their parachutes in real circumstances. And so this is the letter that he had with his little gold caterpillar, which sadly is no longer with us. So I got back from my first trip, and it was all very exciting. And I did the Antiques Roadshow and told the story there. And then I had this call from this person who'd read the newspaper article from the very early on when we were in Klanjec. And he said, I'm going to find your father's plane. And I thought, good heavens, he's not going to find anything. There won't be anything left. Anyway, so the next thing was he's sending me photos. Here's part of the aircraft. He's found the aircraft, not only the aircraft, but an eyewitness as well. So, of course, there's nothing more to do except book my flight again and go back. And so I did. And here we have, on the right is Radovan. And Radovan's hobby is going around Croatia, finding old World War II crash sites and investigating them, finding out the story that goes with them. And Radovan found this lovely gentleman here, Zvonko, who was 11 years old when my father's plane went down. And Zvonko remembers it very well. He remembers going in the morning to the plane. There were bodies on the ground, and he goes inside the plane. And guess what was inside the plane? It was full of food. Now, you wouldn't think that, would you? But apparently that was quite normal to carry lots of food in case, you needed to barter with somebody or you needed to survive. So he said he tasted cookies for the first time. That was not what I was expecting he was going to say. And here we are now. Zvonko takes us to the wood. So this is where the aircraft came down. And we have a moment or two of reflection for the crew that didn't make it. And then a little bit later on, Radovan and his pal here are with their metal detectors and digging in the forest floor. And they start, and I have a carrier bag, and they start filling the carrier bag with bits of Wellington bomber. And so I come back and I go off to the museum at Cosford, RAF Cosford, where they are restoring a Wellington bomber, because I wanted to have an idea of what it was like. And it's basically a cigar tube, very little chance of getting out of there. At the moment, you can see the daylight through it. Of course, it's being reconstructed. And I had one of my little bits of Wellington bomber that I brought from the forest at Klanjec. And miraculously, we were able to identify the parts. That's the one that's in my hand there. And you can see that's actually that bit there. It's something to do with the pulleys, to do with the choke. And then finally, this is very close to home for me. In Wales, in the Brecon Beacons, there were a lot of aircraft were lost during the war on training flights. This is one of the Wellington bomber crash sites where every year the local people will go and just remember the crews of that aircraft. And so I was there, not November just gone, the one before that. And I suppose to finish off, what I'd like to say is that every family has family stories. And I would urge everybody to investigate their family stories before it's too late, because I could easily have been too late. and I wasn't. And it's been an amazing journey and continues to be an amazing journey. So thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Heather, Nicholas here.
Yes.
Could I just say thank you now for what was not only intriguing, fascinating, extremely moving description of your father's war, and did remind us that however the problems seem to bear on us now, there are far greater ones a generation, 2 generations ago. I wanted one question I'd like to just kick off with. Did your father keep in touch with either the Americans he was with or with any of the partisans? I imagine the latter was rather difficult for political reasons.
Absolutely, yes. He would have liked to have stayed in Croatia. I think he would have been quite happy staying in Chasma. I'm not quite sure why that was, but he absolutely admired the partisans for their strength and stoicism. He didn't really want to keep in touch with anybody after this. He moved on in his life, and he didn't. He wasn't somebody that really wanted to be reminded of things. One thing I could say is that the crew he was with that night were not his normal crew. Now, the pilot that he usually flew with was sick, and so he was and the navigator of the stricken aircraft was sick, and so my dad was substituted that night. So they weren't close. He wasn't close friends with the rest of the crew.
Thank you very much. You kindly agreed to take questions, and could people put their hand up if they, I think there's a button somewhere for putting your hand up, which says no, will probably explain.
Okay, well, I saw Frank.
Rather than me.
Sorry, Frank has a question. So go ahead, Frank. Unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yes, it was a wonderful story, actually, and thank you very much for that. It was fascinating to listen to it. I've done some research. I wonder if you had done your research in the National Archives, because that's where I've done mine, because I've been writing a book about the SOE missions in Yugoslavia. And it looks as if the Peter that you mentioned, was it Peter?
Yes.
I think he was a radio operator in the first McLean mission, actually, yeah. when Brigadier Fitzroy landed in September 1943 in Mrkonjić Grad in Bosnia. And he certainly had I don't know whether he was a radio operator, but there was certainly a Peter Moore among his crew, actually.
Wow.
And that group actually were a group that bore a message from Winston Churchill, addressed to Marshal Tito himself. I just wondered if you'd done any research on that.
No, I haven't. My research, I got to admit now, my research was done on Google and Wikipedia. I do apologize for that, but there's so much to this story that I could investigate. And thank you for the suggestion. And that's really fascinating. And I'd love to talk more about your work that you've done.
I guess Snezhana might be able to comment as well, actually.
I'm really sorry, I don't have any more information than you, but maybe that could be another talk in another session. So thank you, Frank. I think, was it Vesna who was the next one who wanted to ask the question?
There was, I wanted to ask how many, because I had my mother was a partisan, and she describes in her book, Memories, her years with the partisan. And she was in Vocin, and she was in Derva when the last offensive. And she talks about a lot of pilots, British pilots, American journalists, who were stranded because they happened like to your father. And she also described the airport where the planes were arriving at night and how they were leaving. And I was going to ask you, do you know the name of the place of the airport? Because she talks about Glamachkopolje.
My understanding is that it is very close to Vocin, where the sawmill is. Just a few kilometers, not kilometers, a few meters from the town itself. I have a description, though. He's described it very clearly. He says from the British mission up in the forest where they were hiding out in the log cabin, 5 miles down to Vocin. So I think that they actually came to Vocin to the field.
Maybe they met. She was after Dervar.
Yes.
She was, but then she was flown to Bari as well.
Yes, really.
There was Randolph Churchill there as well, Churchill's son, with Tito, as she was in Dervar, and then with the headquarters she was flown to after Vocin.
Yes.
So they might have met.
Amazing, isn't it? Isn't it amazing?
I think the world is really small.
Also, there was Masha's mother there. She met Masha's mother at the time. In amazing.
Yes.
Great, thank you, Vesna. There was a comment from Katerina Ottinger. She says that the airstrip is part of Vocin. That's her contribution. And can I just read lovely comments from loads of people who are part of this presentation tonight. From Flora, thank you. It's an amazing story, beautifully presented by you. Sanya Hukovic, amazing talk. Isabel Miles, thank you, very interesting and moving. Greetings from Vocin, from Katarina, thank you for your passionate presentation. From Martin, thank you for presentation, really interesting. From Zrinka, thank you, Heather, for this fascinating account. So really a lot of positive feedback about the talk. So go ahead, any more questions? We have Heather for a few more minutes, and maybe some of you who are here in the UK want to prepare your bells and pans. I think there is the first sort of ringing for the heroes. Yes. I think so. So go ahead. Anyone else would like to ask a question?
Yeah, Robert would like to say something.
Just if I can put a bit of light on this. This is, can you see it? A little compass.
Oh yes.
My dad was ground crew in the Air Force, and there were these around the house in drawers in the 1950s. And I think these were the compasses that airmen would sew in their clothes and put in pockets and hems, so they would have a compass if they had to cross country.
Yeah.
There's still one or two left around in the house.
Yes. Wow. Another thing, in exchange for the book, I should have mentioned this, when Dr. Jelka gave my dad the book, he gave her his silk escape maps of the Balkans. So I imagined, before I knew about Jelka, I imagined that maybe she would have had them made into a blouse or something like that. But I think, no, definitely not. They would have been used for some military purpose, I think.
Great. There was a question from Peter. He emailed it early on. He was saying, do you think the route that you walked, someone else could walk again?
Absolutely, yes. Through the forest, the Medveditsa Hills, you drive to the top. You can drive. You don't have to ride a horse up there. You can drive in your car, and then it's undulating then, and you can beautiful walk through the forest. Lots of fungi to collect as well. So it's a lovely, lovely part of the world.
Great, and actually I can see Davor he was one of your guides, and he is on the call. So hello, Davor.
Yes, hello, Davor.
Croatia, and I hope people note his name and get in touch with him if you want to walk on the wonderful hills of Medvednica, which is.
Feel free to get hold of me through Snezana, and I can put you in touch.
Great. There was another comment from Miles Robinson. What a wonderful story. You must be so pleased to have done it justice for your family and also for us.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's really important to me.
It is, absolutely. Any more questions?
I would like to say hi and a very good evening from Dubai. Here is nearly midnight, and I am so pleased I was able to join the Zoom meeting and was accepted. This is exceptional present for everyone who is out of Croatia or out of UK to be able to be present at such evening, such beautiful evening. It's a beautiful news after all, happy end and romance and forest and planes and parachutes and it is evening packed with adventure. But I would like to say a very good evening, a very good night to all, and I'm off to my bed. Thank you very much, and I'll have a sweet dreams definitely after this. And Heather, Snezana, and all of you, thank you very much for a wonderful evening. A very good evening to all.
Thank you, Lana, for joining us so late. Thank you. Brilliant.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
I think there is a question. Is it from Philippa? Philippa Atke, did you want to say something? No? You need to unmute if you wanted to say.
Unmute. Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Hello. Good evening.
Can you hear?
Yes, go ahead.
I was unfortunately out of the room when you were talking about Fitzroy MacLean. But I was thinking during your talk a little bit of Eastern Approaches, his wonderful book, and I'm sure you read it. But anybody who hasn't read it, I do recommend. It's a really good read. Fitzroy MacLean, Eastern Approaches.
Right.
Have you read it?
If I can just say, I have shared the details of the talk with the Clan MacLean England and Wales. So I think we had a few people joining. So thank you very much for joining tonight.
And thank you, Heather. It was very special. Thank you. Thank you all.
Welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you. There it is. One final, there's a comment from Robert. So nice to hear of these stories. I can relate to other stories of the partisan. I did a book about the partisans in northern Slovenia and the amazing story Flight of the Crow. From Dane Toinko, thank you. What a lovely event. Beautiful story. So thank you all very much. Nicholas, would you like to close the meeting?
I don't want to close the meeting because it's been so interesting and
I know.
and I've been so successful that we'll of course repeat these meetings in future. Heather, I would like to thank you again for what was, as I said earlier, not only extremely interesting and fascinating, but extraordinarily moving. And it also made me reflect, without getting into Brexit, on how fortunate my generation, born after the war, have been, that all those we have mentioned, whether from Croatia, broader Yugoslavia, Germany and Britain, have had a peaceful time in the years then, by and large, and nothing on the scale that our parents and grandparents suffered. So may I, on behalf of us all, thank you. And if anyone wants to unmute, I suggest we give Heather a round of applause. So I shall do it.
Well done, Heather.
Thank you very much, Heather. And I forgot to say earlier that I was in touch with both the ambassador and the British ambassador in Zagreb to check that all their, after the earthquakes, all their staff members and families were well, and the news was very positive and good on that. Please keep an eye on our website, and we'll be in touch about the next meeting. So thank you very much indeed.